50 degrees below zero strips humanity from a person in minutes. Frostbite isn't the true killer. It's the sleepy, seductive warmth that follows. When the deadliest superfreeze in modern history swallowed Pine Ridge, Montana, those who relentlessly mocked Olivia Jenkins were the first to bleed at her reinforced steel door. Grief does not always manifest as tears or withdrawal. For Olivia Jenkins, grief manifested as a used, diesel-chugging Kubota KX40 excavator and a seemingly bottomless hole in her backyard. 3 years before the sky turned a bruised, metallic violet and the temperature plummeted to a record-shattering -74 degrees, Olivia was just a retired high school physics teacher living on the outskirts of Pine Ridge. Then came the Thanksgiving blizzard of 2023. Her husband, David, a rugged man who had lived in the mountains his entire life, was driving back from a neighboring county with a truck full of firewood. A freak whiteout caught him on Interstate 90. He wasn't found until 3 days later. The coroner's report stated that David had frozen to the steering wheel, succumbing to severe hypothermia after his truck's heater failed. It was a mundane, horrifying tragedy that shattered Olivia's world. When the town of Pine Ridge looked at Olivia, they saw a woman broken by loss. When Olivia looked at the world, she saw a fragile, temporary illusion of safety that could be shattered by a simple drop in atmospheric pressure. 6 months after the funeral, the digging began. Her property sat on 3 acres of hard, rocky Montana soil, bordered by a dense line of Douglas firs. At first, her neighbors assumed she was putting in a swimming pool, a ridiculous endeavor in a town where summer lasted barely 8 weeks. But the hole kept getting deeper. When local contractor Jim O'Connor refused to dig past 20 feet, citing bedrock instability and zoning violations, Olivia fired him, bought the Kubota at an estate sale, and took over the operation herself. "You're building a tomb, Olivia," Thomas Miller, the owner of Miller's Hardware, told her one Tuesday afternoon. He was ringing up her latest purchase. 12 rolls of industrial-grade reflective mylar, 50 tubes of closed-cell polyurethane expanding foam, and a pallet of hydraulic cement. Olivia didn't smile. She just pulled out her credit card, her knuckles white and calloused from months of operating heavy machinery. "I'm building an insurance policy, Thomas. The climate is fracturing. The jet stream is wobbling like a top losing momentum. When it snaps, your insulated attic isn't going to save you." Thomas chuckled, shaking his head. "Well, if the Russians drop the bomb, I know whose lawn I'm camping on." The rumors spread through Pine Ridge like a contagion. The town's mayor, a pompous real estate developer named Richard Gregson, even sent a zoning inspector to her house. Olivia, anticipating this, had filed the paperwork under the guise of an extended root cellar and septic overhaul. Because she lived just outside the official city limits, the county regulations were lax, and the inspector left with a shrug. They had no idea what she was actually constructing beneath the frozen earth. Drawing on her background in physics, Olivia designed a subterranean survival chamber, engineered specifically to withstand absolute thermal collapse. The primary space was 500 square feet, buried 25 feet underground. She bypassed standard insulation, instead spending a significant portion of David's life insurance on aerogel blankets, a material developed by NASA that is nearly weightless but boasts the highest insulation value of any known solid. She sandwiched the aerogel between layers of reinforced concrete and high-density polyethylene. But insulation only traps heat. It doesn't generate it. For that, she tapped into the Earth itself. Utilizing old United States Geological Survey maps that David had collected, she identified a localized geothermal hotspot deep beneath her property line. She hired a specialized drilling crew from out-of-state men who didn't know her or the town gossip to sink a closed-loop liquid exchange pipe 300 feet down. The fluid inside, a mixture of water and environmentally safe propylene glycol, absorbed the Earth's natural heat and cycled it up into a radiant floor system beneath the chamber. As long as the Earth's core remained hot, Olivia's bunker would hover at a steady 62 degrees, completely independent of the town's electrical grid. To enter the bunker, one had to go through a heavily modified storm door in her mudroom, descend a steep, spiraling metal staircase, and pass through a marine-grade steel airlock. The airlock was critical. It functioned exactly like a submarine hatch. The outer door had to be hermetically sealed before the inner door could be opened, preventing any sudden influx of freezing air from compromising the chamber's core temperature. Inside, it was a marvel of paranoid efficiency. She had installed a bank of lithium iron phosphate batteries charged by a concealed, low-profile wind turbine she disguised as a ham radio tower. A hydroponic wall fed by LED grow lights held kale, spinach, and dwarf tomatoes. Cases of MREs, water filtration systems, and a manual hand-crank generator lined the walls. By November of the third year, the chamber was finished. The town had long since grown bored of mocking the mad widow of Pine Ridge. They went back to their lives, complaining about the cost of heating oil and preparing for the town's annual winter festival. They did not look at the sky. But Olivia did. She watched the barometric pressure on the antique brass weather station David had given her for their 10th anniversary. The needle had been dropping steadily for 48 hours, not in a normal curve, but in a jagged, terrifying plunge. The local news anchors in Billings were predicting a mild flurry, maybe 2 inches of snow. Olivia walked out to her back porch. The woods were entirely silent. The deer had vanished. The juncos and chickadees, usually aggressively fighting over her bird feeders, were gone. Animals possessed an ancestral warning system that humans had long since traded for convenience. A sudden, sharp gust of wind hit her face. It didn't feel like a normal winter breeze. It felt unnaturally dry, carrying a metallic scent that tasted like old copper pennies. It was the smell of the stratosphere being dragged down to the troposphere. Olivia walked back inside, locked her front door, and began to pack a small duffel bag with her family photo albums. The deadly freeze was here. It began on a Tuesday morning at 10:14 a.m. Mayor Gregson was standing on a makeshift wooden stage in the town square, testing the microphone for the winter festival kickoff, when the sky above Pine Ridge underwent a horrifying transformation. The soft, grey winter clouds did not gather or darken. They simply ceased to exist, flash, frozen into a fine, crystalline dust that hung in the air like diamond powder. The sky turned a sickening shade of bruised violet. Then, the bottom fell out of the thermometer. At 10 a.m., it was 28 degrees Fahrenheit. By 10:30 a.m., it was 0. By 11 a.m., it was -30. And still plummeting. This was not a blizzard. There was no snow. This was a localized atmospheric collapse, a polar vortex anomaly that tore a temporary hole in the jet stream, allowing the unfathomably cold air of the upper atmosphere to spill directly onto the Montana Valley like water from a broken dam. In her house, Olivia watched the digital thermometer mounted on her kitchen wall. The numbers ticked down with the rhythm of a bomb timer. When it hit -40, the house began to scream. The wooden framing groaned and popped as the moisture trapped inside the timber flash-frozen, expanding and splintering the joists. The double-paned windows cracked spiderweb patterns simultaneously, unable to handle the rapid thermal contraction. Out on the street, panic erupted into a lethal chaos. Thomas Miller was in his hardware store when the power grid failed. It didn't just flicker and die. The main transformers at the edge of town exploded in massive showers of blue sparks. The internal cooling oils turned to thick sludge. Without power, the electric heaters died. The natural gas lines, buried too shallowly for this level of extreme cold, froze solid, cutting off the furnaces. People ran for their cars, desperate to flee down the mountain to the valley. But at -50 degrees, automotive batteries lost 90% of their cranking power. Engine blocks cracked. Gasoline thickened into a useless jelly. Cars stalled in the middle of intersections, trapping terrified families inside metal boxes that rapidly became freezers. Mayor Gregson, abandoning the stage, managed to get his heavy-duty diesel truck started. He didn't stop to help anyone. He just pointed the vehicle toward the highway and slammed on the gas. He made it exactly 3 miles before the diesel fuel gelled completely in the lines. When the authorities finally found his truck weeks later, he was curled in the footwell, his face a blue, frozen mask of terror. Back at her property, Olivia knew her upper house was dead. The ambient temperature in the kitchen had dropped to -10 degrees. She could see her breath turning into falling snow inside her own living room. She zipped up her heavy parka, grabbed her duffel bag, and walked to the mudroom. She opened the heavy storm door, stepped onto the metal grating of the staircase, and began her descent. With every step down, the temperature rose. By the time she reached the steel airlock at the bottom, the air was a crisp 40 degrees. She spun the heavy rotary latch, hauled the thick steel door open, stepped into the small vestibule, and sealed it tightly behind her. She waited for the pressure equalization hiss, then opened the inner door. A wave of 62-degree air washed over her. It felt like stepping onto a tropical beach. The soft hum of the geothermal pump and the gentle purple glow of the hydroponic LEDs welcomed her. It was a perfect, isolated sanctuary. The ice-proof chamber had worked flawlessly. She took off her parka, made a cup of instant coffee, using water heated by the geothermal lines, and sat in her armchair. She had enough food, water, and oxygen scrubbing capacity to last 8 months. Up above, she knew, Pine Ridge was dying. She felt a pang of profound sorrow, a hollow ache in her chest that reminded her of the night David died. But she also felt vindication. She was alive. She turned on the monitor connected to her exterior security cameras. The lenses were heated, designed to melt off ice, giving her a crystal-clear view of her front yard. The landscape was unrecognizable. The Douglas firs were snapping in half. The sound like artillery fire as the frozen sap exploded the trunks from the inside out. The air itself seemed to be shimmering, a deadly, freezing fog rolling across the ground. Then, motion caught her eye on camera 3. Olivia leaned forward, spilling hot coffee onto her jeans. She wiped the screen with her sleeve, squinting. Trudging up her long, winding driveway was a figure. They were moving with agonizing slowness, taking one step, pausing, and dragging the other leg forward. The person was wrapped in what looked like a thick, down comforter, bound to their body with duct tape. As the figure staggered closer to the porch camera, they tripped and fell hard onto the frozen concrete. The comforter slipped down. It was Thomas Miller. His face was a horrific shade of grey, his lips split and bleeding sluggishly. Frost covered his eyebrows and eyelashes. But it wasn't his face that made Olivia's breath catch in her throat. Clutched tightly against his chest, wrapped inside his coat, was his 8-year-old daughter, Chloe. Thomas looked directly up at the camera lens. He couldn't speak. His jaw was likely frozen shut. But he lifted one trembling, frost-bitten hand and weakly struck the reinforced front door. Then he slumped forward, covering the child with his own body as the deadly wind howled around them. Olivia stared at the monitor, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The physics of her survival were absolute. The airlock mechanism was strictly designed for one person to enter quickly. To open the main house door, drag 2 people down the stairs, and cycle them through the vestibule would take at least 5 minutes. 5 minutes of exposing the inner chamber to -60-degree air. The sudden influx of catastrophic cold could overwhelm the geothermal pump. The thermal shock might crack the liquid exchange pipes. If the system failed, the chamber would become the very tomb Thomas had joked about. Logic, physics, and survival dictated that she stay in her chair. They had mocked her. They had called her crazy. They had left her to drown in her grief. She watched Thomas Miller's breathing slow to a shallow, irregular rhythm on the monitor. The little girl, Chloe, hadn't moved at all. Olivia closed her eyes, and all she saw was David's truck, buried in the snow on Interstate 90. She saw the empty passenger seat where she should have been. Damn it! Olivia whispered into the silence of the bunker. She slammed her coffee mug onto the table, grabbed her heavy parka, and hit the emergency override button for the inner airlock. Will you risk everything to save the people who abandoned you? The transition from 62 degrees to -50 was not merely uncomfortable, it was a violent physical assault. As Olivia Jenkins forced the inner airlock door open and sprinted up the spiraling metal staircase, the air clawed at her lungs like shattered glass. Her mudroom, usually a buffer against Montana winters, had been fully compromised. The exterior door was trembling violently in its frame, a solid sheet of white frost creeping across its interior surface. Olivia grabbed a heavy iron pry bar from a wall mount. She didn't bother checking the deadbolt. The lock cylinder had already frozen solid, the internal pins seized by contracted metal. She wedged the flat edge of the bar between the door and the jamb, throwing her entire body weight against it. With a sound like a gunshot, the ice seal fractured. The wind ripped the door out of her hands, slamming it against the exterior siding with enough force to splinter the wood. The cold hit her in a suffocating wave. It was an apocalyptic landscape. The air was thick with ice dust, reducing visibility to less than 10 feet. On the porch, Thomas Miller lay motionless, a snowdrift rapidly forming over his rigid back. "Thomas!" Olivia screamed, but the wind snatched the words directly from her mouth. She dropped to her knees, sinking into the razor-sharp snow. Thomas's eyes were open but glassy, the corneas beginning to cloud over from the extreme exposure. He was completely unresponsive. Beneath his heavy, frost-covered coat, a tiny bundle shifted. Chloe. Olivia didn't have the strength to carry him. She grabbed the collar of his heavy canvas jacket with both hands, planted her boots on the slick porch boards, and pulled backward. He slid heavily across the threshold. Getting them into the mudroom was only the first impossible task. The second was getting them down the staircase. Olivia wrestled the ruined front door shut, leaning against it to latch the deadbolt as best she could, though the wind whistled through the newly formed cracks. In the dim light of the frozen room, she unzipped Thomas's coat. Chloe was curled into a tight, fetal ball against her father's chest. Her lips were a terrifying shade of cyan. Her breathing so shallow, it barely moved the fabric of her sweater. Thomas had given her his inner thermal layer. He had essentially sacrificed his own core temperature to keep her heart beating. "Okay, sweetheart. We're going down," Olivia panted, her breath pluming into thick white clouds. She hoisted the 8-year-old girl into her arms. Chloe felt unnervingly light, like a hollow bird. Olivia descended the metal stairs quickly but carefully, the grating slippery with the ice she was dragging in on her boots. She laid Chloe gently on the metal floor of the vestibule, then turned back for Thomas. It took her 6 grueling minutes to drag the 200-pound man down the spiraling steps. By the time she hauled him into the small steel airlock chamber, her own extremities were going numb. The heavy exertion was causing her to sweat, and in negative temperatures, sweat was a death sentence. It was flash freezing against her skin beneath her parka. She crammed Thomas's legs inside and reached for the heavy rotary latch of the outer submarine door. She pulled it shut, but the latch wouldn't turn. Olivia's heart plummeted. She threw her shoulder against the steel wheel, straining until her vision blurred with black spots. The mechanism groaned, but the locking pins refused to engage. She looked at the door frame. The sudden influx of relatively humid air from the upper house had met the -60-degree air rushing in behind them. The moisture had instantly sublimated into a thick layer of rock-hard rime ice, directly over the rubber hermetic seals. The outer door was wedged open by a fraction of an inch. Because of her meticulous paranoid engineering, the airlock was designed with a fail-safe. If the outer door did not electronically register as completely sealed, the magnetic lock on the inner door would not disengage. It was meant to prevent exactly what was happening: catastrophic thermal shock to the main bunker. They were trapped in the 5-by-5-foot vestibule, and the temperature inside the metal box was dropping by the second. Thomas groaned, a terrible, rattling sound deep in his chest. Chloe remained terrifyingly still. "Think, Olivia. Think like an engineer," she muttered to herself, her jaw trembling uncontrollably. She couldn't chip the ice away. The gap was too tight, and the cold was turning the rubber seals as brittle as glass. If she shattered the seal, the door would never close properly again. She looked at the control panel for the inner door. It was a heavy-duty keypad wired directly into the bunker's central processing unit. She needed to bypass the interlock. She tore off her thick outer gloves. Her bare fingers instantly began to burn as she fumbled in her pocket for her Leatherman multi-tool. She wedged the flathead screwdriver beneath the faceplate of the keypad and pried it off. A tangle of insulated wires spilled out. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely grip the tool. The temperature in the vestibule hit -20. Frost was forming on the inside of the steel walls. She located the primary magnetic relay wire, a thick red gauge. She had to strip it and cross it with the ground to short the lock, forcing an open circuit. Her fingers felt like clumsy blocks of wood. She sliced the insulation, nicking her own thumb in the process. She didn't feel the cut, she only saw the blood, which froze into a dark ruby bead almost immediately. With a desperate cry, she jammed the exposed copper wire against the steel framing of the door. A shower of blue sparks erupted, followed by a loud mechanical clack. The magnetic lock disengaged. Olivia threw her weight against the inner door. It swung open, and the three of them spilled onto the floor of the main chamber. The immediate relief of the 62-degree air was instantly overshadowed by the wailing of a klaxon alarm. By leaving the inner door open with the outer door unsealed, Olivia had effectively breached the hull of a submarine under extreme pressure. The unfathomable cold from the surface poured down the stairwell, rushing through the crack in the outer door and flooding the bunker. The digital thermostat on the wall began to tick backward at a terrifying speed. 55, 48, 39. No, 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 Olivia gasped. She scrambled back to the airlock. She couldn't fix the outer door, but she could manually engage the inner door's deadbolts to seal the breach. She grabbed the heavy steel handle and pulled it shut, engaging the 4 manual locking pins. The breach was sealed, but the damage was done. The ambient temperature in the bunker had crashed to 31 degrees. Across the room, the hydroponic wall flickered. The fragile leaves of the dwarf tomatoes withered and blackened almost instantly, killed by the flash frost. The klaxon alarm continued to scream. Olivia ran to the utility closet housing the geothermal pump. The system monitor was flashing a critical red warning. Glycol viscosity high, pump cavitation imminent. The sudden, massive thermal drop had cooled the radiant floor pipes too quickly. The propylene glycol mixture, designed to flow like water, was thickening into a dense slush. The pump was whining loudly, struggling to push the gelled fluid through the 300-foot underground loop. If the pump burned out, the bunker would lose its only heat source, and they would slowly freeze to death in the dark. Olivia grabbed a heavy wrench. There was a bypass valve on the primary return line. If she opened it, she could dump the sludged glycol into a containment reservoir and inject a reserve tank of pure, unmixed antifreeze directly into the lines to thin the mixture. But the system was under high pressure. She positioned the wrench over the brass valve, took a deep breath, and turned it. The valve blew open with a violent hiss. A spray of toxic, partially frozen green fluid erupted across the utility closet, splattering across Olivia's face and chest. It burned her skin, but she didn't let go. She muscled the bypass lever down, isolating the sludged fluid, and slammed her hand onto the emergency injection button. The pump whined in a high-pitched scream of metal on metal. Olivia held her breath. Slowly, agonizingly, the pitch of the motor dropped to a steady, rhythmic thrum. The pure antifreeze hit the lines, clearing the slush. The fluid began to circulate again, drawing heat from the deep earth. Olivia slumped against the wall, sliding down to the concrete floor, covered in green fluid and shaking from adrenaline. 35 degrees, 41 degrees, 50 degrees. The numbers on the thermostat began to climb. The crisis had passed. Over the next 48 hours, the bunker became a makeshift trauma ward. Olivia utilized the medical supplies she had stockpiled, to slowly and safely elevate the core temperatures of her uninvited guests. Chloe recovered remarkably quickly, her youthful resilience shining through. She sat wrapped in an aerogel blanket, quietly eating warm, rehydrated stew. Thomas was not so lucky. He had lost 3 toes on his left foot and the tips of 2 fingers on his right hand to severe frostbite. His face was mottled with purple and black tissue damage. On the 3rd day, as the geothermal system hummed reliably in the background, Thomas finally sat up in the cot Olivia had provided. He looked around the reinforced, brightly lit chamber. "You were right," he whispered, his voice raspy from windburn. "God help me, Olivia. You were right about all of it." Olivia sat across from him, sipping a cup of instant coffee. "Why did you come here, Thomas?" "My house is 3 miles from the town centre. You passed 50 other houses to get up my hill." Thomas looked down at his bandaged hands. He swallowed hard. "Because the others didn't have power. I saw the transformers blow. I knew the houses would be dead within the hour." He hesitated, looking at Chloe, then back to Olivia. "And I knew about this place." Olivia narrowed her eyes. "Everyone in town made fun of this place." "Made fun of it, yes. But Mayor Gregson, he didn't just laugh," Thomas confessed, his voice heavy with guilt. "2 months ago, he brought your property blueprints into the hardware store. He was looking for industrial locks. He told me he was going to declare your land structurally condemned in the spring under county zoning laws. He planned to seize the property, pave over your bunker, and expand the new subdivision." Olivia's grip tightened on her mug. The betrayal stung, even though the world above was dead. "He knew you had a self-sustaining grid down here," Thomas continued. "When the sky turned white, Gregson abandoned the stage. He tried to drive his truck up here to take the bunker for himself by force. I saw him leave, but his diesel gelled up at the bottom of the access road." "And you?" Olivia asked coldly. "I stole the municipal snowcat from the public works depot," Thomas admitted. "It had a block heater. I loaded Chloe in it and followed Gregson's tracks. The snowcat died halfway up your driveway. We walked the rest of the way." He looked at her, tears welling in his damaged eyes. "I didn't come to steal it, Olivia. I didn't want my little girl to die. You were the only chance we had." Olivia looked at the man who had mocked her, the man who had supplied the very parts that saved his life. She felt the lingering anger dissipate, replaced by a profound, heavy exhaustion. Survival wasn't about vengeance. It was about endurance. "You're here now, Thomas," she said softly. "That's all that matters." The super freeze held Pine Ridge in its lethal grip for 9 agonizing days. Above ground, the localized anomaly shattered historical records, plunging the region into a stasis of absolute zero. On the 10th day, the barometric pressure normalized. The unnatural violet hue of the sky faded, replaced by the pale, cold blue of a standard Montana winter. The ambient temperature rose to a balmy 22 degrees Fahrenheit. When Olivia finally forced the inner airlock open and chipped away the ice from the outer door, she emerged into a world of crystalline silence. The trees were shattered. The town below was a frozen tomb. 2 days later, the deafening thrum of rotors broke the silence. A United States National Guard UH-60 Black Hawk, piloted by a Captain Arthur Hayes, touched down in the open field adjacent to Olivia's property. They were the first reconnaissance team to penetrate the disaster zone. Captain Hayes and his crew found exactly 3 survivors in the entire municipality of Pine Ridge. They found a widow, a hardware store owner, and a little girl standing on a porch, completely unharmed, drinking hot coffee. When the military engineers eventually inspected Olivia's subterranean chamber, they were astounded. Her paranoid, grief-fueled project was subsequently studied by FEMA and the Department of Energy as a masterclass in autonomous geothermal survival architecture. Olivia Jenkins never returned to teaching physics. She didn't have to. She had taught the world a much harsher lesson. The Earth provides a sanctuary, but only for those willing to dig deep enough to find it. If you were captivated by Olivia's incredible survival against impossible odds, don't keep this story to yourself. Hit that like button to support our channel, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that preparation can be the difference between life and death. Subscribe, and ring the bell for more gripping, true-to-life survival dramas. What would you build to survive? Let us know in the comments below.